Melinda Fitzgerald is Professor of Neurotrauma and Deputy Director of the Curtin Health Innovation Research Institute at Curtin University, jointly appointed by the Parent Institute for Neurological and Translational Science. She is leader of the Mission for Traumatic Brain Injury, a new medical research future fund initiative providing $50 million in federal government funding over 10 years. Brain Injury Australia represents consumers on the mission. Please welcome Lindy.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and for the invitation to come and chat to you all here today. Nick asked me to begin with just a little bit about what I'm doing in terms of my own research. And so I thought just in one slide I'd summarise a little bit about my own personal research program. My work is designed to understand the mechanisms of damage following injury to the brain or to the central nervous system. And one of the key mechanisms is that following the point of injury, the damage spreads into the surrounding tissue. And it's sort of this spread of damage that gives us an opportunity to treat, and so understanding those mechanisms is what I do for quite a bit of my research. We use that understanding of mechanism to be able to design therapeutic strategies, and we use combinations of inhibitors in order to be able to control some of the damage mechanisms, and also nanotechnologies to perhaps deliver those better. And then always, though, we have clearly in mind how we would be able to translate those findings into people who have experienced these kind of injuries. And so one of the ways we're going about doing that at the moment is identifying people who might benefit from treatments following concussion. And so we've just started a new large-scale observational clinical trial called CREST, the Concussion Recovery Study, designed to identify predictors of poor outcome following concussion. So that's sort of in a little potted version what we're doing in the lab and the clinic over in Western Australia in my labs. But what I'd really like to talk to you about today is our work that I've been fortunate to be involved in as part of a collaborative team who, of people from around Australia. Oops, I think I've just gone the wrong way. I'll just pop that back. And people who have experience in all these different craft groups that are so very important in traumatic brain injury research. So we're talking about emergency department physicians and intensivists, rehabilitation experts, neuroscientists, and a group of 26 people came together in a formative team to work on a national approach to improve lives following traumatic brain injury of all severities, so all the way from concussion through to the more severe injuries. So this initiative has included lots and lots of people from around the country. So myself in Western Australia, Bob Vink in South Australia, and lots of people here in Victoria, as it's a really strength area in traumatic brain injury research in Australia. And some of them will be on the panel, and our own Nick Rushworth is part of that team. Researchers in Tasmania and in New South Wales, in Queensland, and also in the Northern Territory to ensure that we have appropriate measures put in place to encompass Indigenous and remote communities. So this group came together and to answer the sort of key question and the real knowledge gap: why is it that some patients recover quickly and completely and others don't? And to try and identify that issue, we came up with two large-scale aims of research. The first of which was to identify predictors of poor outcome following traumatic brain injury, and the second to try and develop feasible interventions that can improve lives following these kinds of injuries. To do that, two main goals were put in place. The first, to define a registry, a clinical and research registry of all traumatic brain injury in Australia, so that we can actually track what happens to people from even before their injury, the factors around their injury, and then onwards to the various journeys as they go through their treatments. And then to conduct clinical trials in a nationally consistent way across Australia, so we can overcome some of the difficulties of small trials and site-specific biases. So we put together a really large-scale document that kind of outlined the approach, and encompassing all kinds of important elements, including remote communities and international linkages, and understanding the benefit of the approach. And this was then put to the Minister for Health, Mr Greg Hunt, and that was resulted in the announcement of a mission for traumatic brain injury, which is very exciting. So the mission is a large-scale funding initiative where $50 million has been appointed to traumatic brain injury research across 10 years. And this has been a very interesting process. I've been appointed as the chair of the expert advisory panel. Now, the expert advisory panel is a really important group in missions. There's quite a few different missions for different things. There's a stem cell mission and a Million Minds mission, and now there's a traumatic brain injury mission. And the first step with a mission is to appoint this panel. That's been a process that has taken a lot longer than I anticipated, dealing with the Department of Health in terms of defining what were the remit of those people. It needs to be 50-50 gender balanced and nationally representative and have a range of expertise. And it's been quite delayed as it's become now a whole-of-government process to ensure real accountability in the mission process. So once the mission expert advisory panel is announced, which we're now expecting in the next few weeks, the first task will be to define the terms of reference and then to develop a draft of a roadmap. Now, this roadmap is a document that's going to define the funding priorities, what we're actually going to spend money on for the mission for traumatic brain injury. And that will be a very collaborative and consultative process where we'll go out for consultation and then finalise that roadmap and then go for government approval, and then finally there'll be a call for funding. So just to give you a bit of a look at that, this is what a draft roadmap, roadmap looks like. So 2 pages to define what you're going to spend or funding priorities for 10 years. So we've got to try and get this right. And so the important thing I think we need to do is to consult very widely as quickly as possible so we can get a very clear idea about what the community and the research community and also the broader community think are good things to research. So with that in mind, I've convened a number of different working groups, and I just thought I'd step you through some of what these working groups are saying we should spend money on, what the funding priorities should be. And I welcome your feedback as to whether you agree or disagree with any of these points. But firstly, the working group on concussion has come up with a number of key ways of facilitating research. As some of you may know, if you know people or have yourself experienced a concussion, finding that these patients tend to slip through the gaps. There's not a confined and consistent treatment strategy for concussion. And so we're looking at ways as to how we can identify these patients and track them, and so and follow their outcomes so we can improve those outcomes. So using concussion clinics is a way forward for that, and we might have to grow those clinics in states where they don't exist. A clinical and research registry for concussion was considered to be really important by the concussion research community in order to identify predictors of outcome. It's going to be really important to identify what's useful and cost effective to put in such a registry and then track those people over long term. I'd love a scenario where we can track people and in 50 years' time find out if they're at greater risk of neurodegenerative disease, because there's not really a lot of evidence in that space at this point in time. Raising awareness is going to be extremely important because there's not a consistent sense of whether people should seek medical care following a concussion. I think that's an area that needs a lot of work. And then to do nationally based clinical trials, we're going to have to be very consultative as to what we choose to test. So a subgroup that's arisen from that is to work on guidelines and health pathways in concussion. Again, it's not really a strong evidence base that everyone knows about what we should do following concussion, and that's growing in the paediatric space, and there's a large-scale review that's going to be coming out soon in that. We need to do the same thing for adult concussion so that we can develop those kind of fact sheets that are not just specific to sports concussion, but are actually useful for concussion of all etiologies. Concussion actually occurs more commonly as a result of motor vehicle accidents and falls than it does of sport. So sort of understanding those, the best way to guide people through a referral process so that they don't slip through the gap and have these persisting symptoms for way longer than they should. So another working group that's been convened is the working group on rehabilitation. This is an area that I personally don't have a lot of research experience in, so it was quite an eye-opener for me as to what the research community thought was important in terms of rehabilitation research. And one of the things that really came out very strongly was something that's come out in the talks today, like Jenny Ponsford talked about, is the understanding that these are very heterogeneous cohorts. People following traumatic brain injury have all kinds of different symptoms, and it's not suitable to have a broad brush approach of a registry or clinical trials with a one-size-fits-all kind of mentality. That's not going to work. We actually need a very symptom-focused and specific approach if data is going to go into a registry and actually be useful. Because the idea is that we need to be able to increase implementation of what we already know. There's a lot of good evidence out there, and it's not necessarily being applied in a consistent fashion across all the different sites of healthcare provision. And to conduct national trials, we need to identify who benefits from a specific intervention and why that might be, and then address some of the systematic issues that are impacting on accessibility and access of the services available. And so there's another couple of working groups that are just about to be convened, a working group on acute care and also on imaging and also on blood biomarkers, so that's all in the process, hopefully, before the expert advisory panel meets. And as you can see, there's a hell of a lot to do, and so the money, while it sounds like a lot of money, may not be enough. So we're in the process of now setting up a company called Vision TBI, which will be a charitable organisation that can take leveraged funds from state governments, institutions, from philanthropy to enable us to really make sure that we can enhance, support and increase the outcomes of the mission for traumatic brain injury and get the greatest bang for our buck from this substantial investment. So it is a charitable institution. It's going to have an independent board of directors and a scientific advisory committee, and there'll be a great care taken to manage conflict of interest and make sure that it's governed appropriately and ethically. It'll have the appropriate sort of corporate structure around it and members that have a demonstrated commitment to the purpose of the company. So the funding model that is being put in place will be, as I mentioned, sort of leveraging funding from accident insurance commissions, from state governments and philanthropy. We're fortunate that we've already got some support on board. Curtin University, which is my university, and also Monash University have committed $200,000 a year for 10 years, which is a real sort of demonstration of trust, and we're very grateful for this support that it'll seed the pot. We hope to be able to really do something really different in this space. It really gives us hope, I think, to be able to improve outcomes for patients. We'll disseminate these funds for research, and then we'll also raise awareness, we want to set in place a website that will actually serve as a central hub for evidence-based information, for fact sheets, for recruiting participants for trials, for sort of two-way dissemination of information, and all with the clear goal to enable and support the mission for traumatic brain injury work and to ensure its longevity. So just to summarise and conclude, this sort of maps out what we're going to be doing. We've got the mission for traumatic brain injury that is managed by the Department of Health. It's advised by an expert advisory panel. There will be consultation and the development of a roadmap, and then there will be, if all goes as we think it may in terms of the formative team's initial ideas, we will come up with a clinical and research-based registry that will really increase our understanding of the course of a patient's progression through their journey following these kinds of injuries. And there will be competitive grants administered through the NHMRC for other elements of the work that are such as clinical trials. And then in parallel with that will be Vision TBI, which will enhance and support that work, governed by an independent advisory panels and ensuring longevity with constant liaison between the two to make sure that we're working in synergy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
I can imagine there are questions for Lindy. Anyone with a question about Mission TBI? Its purpose? Yes.
Just a question about the methodology. I guess my first reaction when I heard your comments was concussion clinics in Australia, really? I've lived here for 30 years, and when my son was injured 4.5 years ago, nobody ever referred him to a concussion clinic. We also know that most people who experience a concussion don't
Excellent. Thank you so much, because they are excellent questions. In a very short presentation, I wasn't able to disseminate everything that's in my head. We're not limiting just to concussion clinics. So the working group has come up with a 5 or 6 page document that details all of the different approaches. So that's just sort of one slide on a page. The concussion clinics is really what I'd like there to be, and I agree that they're not there in many states. There's some, like there's the Epworth Centre that are running a good concussion clinic. There's various ones in New South Wales that are more focused around sports-related concussion. And so what I would like to see is actually Vision TBI concussion clinics in every state, and then raising the awareness that people should be seeking medical attention. I completely agree with you that there's a huge gap, and that's what we want to address with this. And so about probably 10% of concussions go to emergency departments at the moment, and not many go to GPs, we're finding out. Concussion clinics are sporadic. So what we want to do is actually develop a health pathway so that it is clear that people, A, should seek medical attention, and B, should follow this progression, perhaps through a hub and spoke model where they go to a clinic, and if they've got complicated concussion, then they can be managed there. If it's sort of relatively straightforward and they're likely to recover in a standard sort of time frame, then they go out to GPs with appropriate education to those GPs. So that was just sort of part of a much larger strategy that we're looking at. And then in terms of your question about consulting and doing a scoping sort of study, if you like, about existing guidelines, absolutely. That's where we'll have to start. There's the Zurich, the consensus statements and so forth, the concussion and sport guidelines that come out every 4 years. That's a good starting point because it's nicely evidence-based, but it's only sports-related. So we need to scope the evidence very carefully. As I mentioned, that's being done in paediatrics now, and we'll have to do the same thing in adult, draw from that evidence base.
Can you please thank Lindy?